Most people believe that when a man is truly in love, he becomes emotional, but that is only the surface. Real love, the kind that awakens him, doesn't just stir his feelings. It sharpens his vision. It quiets the noise. It is not excitement that changes him. It is peace. In the presence of the one woman his soul recognizes, a man begins to shift, not loudly, but profoundly. He no longer seeks escape. He begins to build not a life of indulgence, but a life of meaning, not because she demands it, but because something about her presence reflects back a version of him that he had long forgotten, the man who lives with clarity, with discipline, with reverence. And so, when a man truly loves, he doesn't just feel more, he becomes more, not for her, but because of her, silently, steadily, permanently. We've been taught to measure a man's love by how loud he says it, by how often he calls, how tightly he holds, how passionately he pursues. But the awakened man loves differently, not with barks, but with stillness. When he meets the woman whose energy anchors him, whose presence quiets the noise he never knew he was drowning in, he doesn't erupt in fireworks. He exhales. He lets go of the chase. Not because he's lost interest, but because for the first time, he feels found in her stillness. He discovers a mirror, not to his ego, but to his essence. His distractions lose their grip. His craving for novelty fades. He begins to wake up earlier, speak less, but mean more. He organizes his world, not to impress her, but because the mess no longer matches the clarity she inspires. In neuroscience, this shift has a name: state regulation. His nervous system, once ruled by the limbic brain, the part that reacts, flees, fights, begins to settle. Her calm communicates safety, and safety does what no seduction can do. It allows him to stay in the room, stay in the moment, stay with himself. This is the beginning of masculine transformation, not through force, but through frequency. He no longer needs chaos to feel alive. Her presence offers something rarer, belonging, and so you may not notice the shift in him at first. It won't come in grand gestures. It won't flood your inbox. It will show up in the subtle, in the way he starts to listen, in the way he begins to lead with presence instead of performance. Because real love doesn't demand a man to be more. It invites him to remember who he already is. Beneath the armor, beneath the image, beneath the noise, and in the stillness of her presence, he begins to rise. Not as a lover chasing a moment, but as a man returning home to himself. Pressure may change a man's behavior, but it is peace that changes his nature. Many women are taught to ignite change through urgency, to question, to correct, to teach, but the man who carries ancient restlessness, the man who has spent years outrunning his own shadows, will not yield to force. He yields to stillness, not because he is weak, but because stillness speaks in a language his soul remembers. When he meets a woman whose energy does not mirror his chaos, but grounds it, he finds something he did not know he was seeking. He finds the end of the chase. Not a woman who needs fixing, not a woman who tries to fix him, but a woman who is anchored in herself, in her breath, in her presence. And suddenly, he no longer feels the urge to run. The chaos inside him, which once mistook drama for love, begins to soften. He begins to crave peace, not passion, presence, not performance. In Eastern philosophy, this is called anchoring energy, the silent force that centers the unstable, not by controlling it, but by existing beside it, unwavering. From a neurological view, this is co-regulation. When two people meet, their nervous systems speak before their words do. A woman who has done the inner work, who breathes instead of reacts, who observes instead of over-explains, becomes a sanctuary. And the man whose system has long lived in survival mode finds something he has never known: safety with dignity. He begins to serve, not to win her, but because something sacred within him is awakening. The protector, the builder, the man who creates order, not for approval, but from reverence. He no longer performs to be seen. He begins to see. And what he sees is her. Not the mask she wears to be lovable, but the still soul who reminds him of who he could become. This is the love that doesn't shout. This is the shift that doesn't announce itself, but you will know it by its fruit. He starts waking up earlier. He makes different decisions, not because she told him to, but because in the quiet of her peace, he remembered the man he was always meant to be. A man doesn't reveal himself because you asked him to. He reveals himself when the environment is sacred enough to hold his truth. Most men are not taught to speak. They are taught to act, taught to protect, to provide, to perform. But behind every performance is a silence waiting to be heard. That silence holds the boy who was once told, "Don't cry, man up, don't be weak." And so he learned to guard his inner world, not out of pride, but out of protection, until one day he meets her. Not the loudest voice, not the most demanding energy, but the woman who listens without interruption, who breathes instead of reacts, who holds instead of hurries. And in her presence, something begins to shift. He offers her a fragment, a memory, a wound, a doubt, not to be rescued, but to be received. And what she does next matters more than anything she could say. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't try to fix. She simply breathes with him. And in that breath, he feels the rarest form of love. Acceptance without condition. In psychology, this is called emotional attunement. When a man feels emotionally safe, his brain begins to shift from the limbic system, the home of fear and fight, to the prefrontal cortex, the home of reflection, planning, and empathy. This is not philosophy. This is biology, and it changes everything. He begins to regulate himself through the relationship, not around it, not with escape, but with presence. This does not mean he suddenly floods her with emotion. No, it means he begins to speak with more care. He pauses before responding. He listens not just to answer, but to understand. His vulnerability is no longer a risk. It becomes a bridge, a sacred connection between two inner worlds. But this steps is not offered to everyone. A man can be surrounded by lovers, companions, and friends, and still keep this part of himself sealed. Why? Because most people respond to male vulnerability with panic, shame, or strategy. But she, the awakened woman, responds with stillness. She doesn't need to solve his pain. She simply becomes the space where his pain is no longer a threat. And that is when he begins to unfold slowly, quietly, but completely, not to be impressive, but to finally be known. And in that knowing, a new kind of love is born. Not a love based on adrenaline or chase, but a love rooted in trust, reflection, and truth. When a man feels emotionally safe, something ancient begins to awaken. Not just the lover, not just the provider, but the protector. And this protection is not loud, it is not jealous, it is not about power or possession. It is quiet devotion. In a world that trains men to conquer, the awakened man begins to preserve. He protects not to control, but to care, not to dominate, but to honor. True masculine protection is spiritual. It doesn't show up only when danger is near. It shows up in the daily attentiveness to what matters. When a woman becomes a sanctuary of peace in his life, he begins to feel that she is not just someone to love. She is someone to guard. Not like a possession, like a sacred garden. This is when his masculine energy stops performing and starts serving. You may not hear the words, "I love you," every day, but you'll see it in the way he shields her peace, in the way he creates room for her voice, in the way he shows up, not with grand gestures, but with quiet consistency. This kind of devotion doesn't need reminders. It is embedded into his nervous system when he feels emotionally responsible, not for her life, but for the atmosphere they share. And perhaps most powerfully, he doesn't run from her storms. He stays, not to fix her emotions, but to be the ground beneath them. In ancient warrior traditions, the strongest man was not the one with the sharpest sword, but the one who could return from battle and hold space for his family with gentleness and grace, to stand still when emotions swirl, to listen without defense. This is not weakness. This is strength refined by love. In this moment, he is not trying to win her. He is simply choosing to be present, not because he has to, but because she matters, and her well-being has become part of his purpose. You see, a man cannot protect what he does not value, and he will not value what he does not feel energetically connected to. His actions become precise, not controlled by fear, but guided by care. Not powered by ego, but fueled by devotion. This is how the protector rises. Not from testosterone, from trust, not with armor, but with attunement. And in this quiet loyalty, a man begins to feel not only whole, but honorable. When a man truly loves, not from infatuation, but from reverence, something unseen begins to shift. he doesn't just show up for the relationship. He begins to show up for himself. He starts to clean up his life, not out of fear, not to impress, but because love has awakened in him a sacred responsibility. For the first time, his time feels precious. His energy feels purposeful. And mediocrity becomes unacceptable, not to her, but to him. In the presence of the woman who reflects back his deeper potential, the man begins to remember what he once forgot. That order is not restriction, it is freedom. That discipline is not sacrifice, it is devotion in form. And so, he begins to move differently. He trims the excess, he limits distractions, not because she asked him to, but because her presence reminds him his life matters. His presence matters. He is no longer a wanderer. He is becoming a guardian of the sacred. This is not the transformation born from pressure. It is the transformation born from clarity. In psychology, this is called identity congruency. When a man's external actions begin to align with his internal values, and this alignment liberates him. He no longer needs to wear masks. One for work, one for friends, one for her. He becomes centered. His energy is no longer fragmented. He stops trying to be everything. He starts becoming someone true. There's a sacred story told in Zen tradition of a man who, after falling in love, began sweeping the temple grounds each morning at sunrise. When asked why, he answered, "Because someone now lives in my heart, and I must keep it clean." Real love does not demand perfection, but it calls him higher, not by controlling him, but by reminding him that he is no longer living just for himself. He is living in response to something sacred. He begins to ask, what kind of man do I want to be when I stand beside her? Not out of insecurity, but from honor. When a man cleans his life, not for applause, not for approval, but because he has fallen in love with the clarity that love demands, you will witness the rarest kind of transformation. Not a man performing, but a man returning to his integrity, one choice at a time, one breath at a time, one sacred disciplined act at a time. There comes a moment in a man's life when love stops being a feeling and starts becoming a mirror. Not a mirror of how much he is adored, but a reflection of how deeply he is seen. And in that reflection, he begins to remember the man he was always meant to be. This is the beginning of something sacred. Not chemistry, but congruency, identity congruency. The point where his outer behavior begins to match his inner truth. Not because he's performing, but because he's aligning. The man who once scattered his energy across distractions, addictions, and empty pursuits begins to withdraw it and bring it home. He no longer wakes up just to get through the day. He wakes up with a quiet vow to live with intention, because someone now sees him not as a role to play, not as a body to desire, but as a soul to rise with. And he cannot face that kind of gaze with a fragmented life. This is when his identity begins to crystallize. He stops splitting himself. No more one man at work, another in love, another in silence. His boundaries become cleaner. His actions carry weight, not because he's trying to prove anything, but because he now understands. Every choice is a seed, and the love he's building is not delicate. It is rooted. From a neuroscience perspective, this is the activation of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reflection, future planning, and self-regulation. The dopamine he once chased from novelty now comes from progress, from discipline, from showing up fully present for the life he's chosen to honor. He doesn't need to be told what to do. Her presence is not a demand. It's a standard. She doesn't control him. She inspires clarity in him. Her self-respect becomes the rhythm that recalibrates his chaos. And now he cannot carry his old patterns into her peace without feeling the dissonance within himself. This is the birth of integrity, not built on rules, but built on remembrance of who he truly is when he's no longer hiding, not from her, but from himself. Because when a man sees himself through the eyes of love, he doesn't shrink, he rises. And in that rising, love is no longer something he feels. It becomes something he embodies. The most powerful devotion a man offers is not the one he's told to give. It is the one that rises in the presence of a woman who demands nothing but carries everything. She does not manipulate. She does not chase. She doesn't need him to be perfect. She simply exists as a space of clarity that exposes all the places within him, still cluttered with noise. In a world where so many women are taught to push, pursue, persuade, the feminine sanctuary does something revolutionary. She receives, not passively, but consciously. She holds a sacred neutrality, not judging what he brings, not rushing to fix what he reveals, but simply witnessing with unwavering presence. And because she does not flinch, he begins to speak more, not to explain himself, but to be seen without shame. This is the kind of woman who changes a man's direction, not by force, but through energetic safety. In psychology, this is attunement. In spirit, it is an invitation back to the self. He begins to notice something rare. In her presence, he feels no need to perform. He feels trusted. And in that trust, his devotion is born, not out of obligation, but from overflow. You see, men are not moved by pressure. They are moved by peace. They are transformed, not by tactics, but by truth felt, not forced. And the feminine sanctuary does not give him a checklist. She gives him a mirror, one so calm that it reveals his restlessness, one so grounded that it shows him his misalignment, but most of all, one so accepting that it allows him to evolve without fear. This is devotion without demand, where nothing is expected, but everything is elevated, not because she told him to rise, but because her energy made it impossible for him to stay the same. She didn't change him. She reminded him. And in her stillness, he becomes a man not just capable of love, but worthy of carrying it. There is a form of love so rare, so quiet, that most never recognize it. It does not shout. It does not demand. It shows up every day. It is called consistency. In a world obsessed with passion and intensity, we have forgotten the sacred power of a man who chooses not once, but over and over again to rise, to stay, to serve, to lead, to love with intention. The awakened man learns that love is not built in grand gestures, but in repeated ones, in keeping the promise even when no one is watching, in showing up not only when it's convenient, but especially when it's not. He no longer confuses momentum with maturity. He understands that the foundation of love is not made of sparks. It is laid brick by brick, in silence, in intention, in rhythm. This is when his masculinity becomes mastery, because true strength is not how loud he can love, but how long he can love. In modern psychology, this is emotional regulation. In spiritual language, it is honoring the sacred rhythm. Consistency is not routine. It is devotion in action. And it is in this devotion that he finally begins to trust himself. He no longer fears the emotional waves. He learns to anchor through storms. His energy becomes a structure, a place she can rest in, not because she is weak, but because his presence is strong. And what is strength if it cannot be trusted? This is the kind of love that builds temples, not bonfires. A temple requires patience, stillness, precision. So he becomes precise. Not perfect, but present. Consistency is how a man tells the truth when words fall short. It is how he says, I am here. I'm not only here when it's easy. I am here when you are soft and when you are sharp. I am here when I'm praised and when I'm unseen. Because for him, love is not a feeling he falls into. It is a practice he returns to. In the East, there is a saying, the master is not the one who moves fast, but the one who returns to the same place with deeper reverence. This is how love deepens, through rhythm, through stillness, through consistency that becomes a meditation, a prayer, a vow, lived, not spoken. He may not always have the perfect words, but his presence says everything. You are worth building something sacred with. And I will build it one step, one choice, one sacred return at a time. Love, when it is true, does not arrive as a storm. It arrives as a discipline, a rhythm, a practice, a sacred way of living. Most people chase love for the intensity, the adrenaline of the beginning, the butterflies, the obsession. But those things fade, and what remains is what was built in the silence. That is where sacred love begins. Not in the spark, but in the structure. When a man chooses to love as a discipline, he no longer confuses emotion with devotion. He understands that feelings are fleeting, but values are constant. And so he roots himself in principle, not to control, but to honor her, himself. The space between them He shows up not because she reminds him, but because she no longer needs to. His love becomes a way of life. And in this devotion, there is no fear of losing freedom, because he has realized something sacred. Love is not a cage. Love is the reason he has wings. He no longer seeks escape. He seeks to embody presence, to bring calm where there was once chaos, to bring truth where there was once performance. This is not about being soft. It is about being refined. The man who once chased approval now cultivates character. The man who once feared intimacy now protects it. The man who once lived for excitement now lives for depth. Because in her presence, he discovered that greatness isn't measured by what he conquers, but by what he can sustain. And she didn't force this from him. She became a sanctuary, still, whole, grounded in self-respect. Her stillness became the mirror that showed him what he was capable of. Not by asking for more, but by being more. And so he rose, not because she told him to, but because something sacred in her presence reminded him, you are a man worth becoming. In the East, the disciple does not prove himself in battle, but in the quiet, repetitive acts of service, the tea, the silence, the breath, the return. This is what devotion looks like, when it becomes a way of being. When a man loves as discipline, you may not notice it on the first day, or the 5th, but by the 100th, in the 1000th, you will feel the structure that love has built beneath your life. And you will know this is not a man who promised to love you once. This is a man who became love again and again, one sacred choice at a time. In a world chasing noise and novelty, he chose rhythm. He chose to build love like a temple, slow, intentional, sacred, not to impress, but to become one choice, one breath, one quiet offering at a time. Love is not something you fall into. It is something you return to daily. This is not performance. This is presence. This is sacred. This is self-mastery.